Welcome to Cartoonist Kayfabe. My name's Ed Piskor.
I'm Jim Rugg.
We've got a legend in the house, man. Peter Chung, the great animation director. Typically, I would say name some books in the bibliography. But Jim, I'm going to have you name a couple of things in the filmography, and we'll just get launched right into things.
Sounds good. First thing I would say is has worked for everybody in a 40-year career in animation: Disney, Bakshi, Warner Brothers, Nickelodeon, MTV. Some of the standout stuff for our audience is probably Transformers and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles early on. But Rugrats and AEON Flux is probably when he really enters our sphere with MTV's Liquid Television. As of late, Animatrix, Revision Tomb Raider, Fire Breather. Just a spectacular career that really spans several types of animation and very influential to multiple generations at this point.
Pete, thanks for coming by the Cartoonist Kayfabe channel.
Oh, my pleasure. So very glad to meet you two guys and enjoyed what you're doing. I've watched a lot of your interviews with some of my friends and colleagues.
Your name has come up a couple of times for sure.
Yeah.
One of the big questions I've always wanted to ask. This is huge for me, Jimmy, because I often scour the net for Peter Chung interviews and wisdom, and it's super cool to get a chance to record a big one because you can't find as much as I want. And one of the things is that I think of you, Peter, as a visionary creator, a true artist, an auteur, whatever label you want to put on that. But in animation, you chose this collaborative and sometimes corporate medium industry. It requires a lot of people to get your vision across. I guess one question I have, because I think we'll be on this topic for a little while today, one question I have is, do you have a particular part of your art practice that's unique to you that you don't have to share it with anybody? Do you keep a very active sketchbook?
Everything I do is like that, as far as I'm concerned. I work, even though animation is a very collaborative medium, I don't like the atmosphere of a bustling animation studio, and I especially don't like the way animation is produced in the US, especially with feature animation, because everything is based on pitching your ideas to a room full of people. And that's one aspect of animation production that I really dislike. And so as far as my, I don't know how you put it, my secret private process, I tend to be very guarded about what I show, work in progress. When you work at an American animation studio, everybody wants to have a say in everything you're doing at every stage. And I feel much more comfortable about working on something and getting it into a state where I feel happy about being able to publicly show it. Because I'm very hard on myself. I mean, the person who gives the hardest notes on my work is me. It's always going to be me. I'm always going to be much tougher than any of the other people in the room. And so I don't find usually the notes of my colleagues when they see my work in progress very helpful. Because they're not seeing the problems that I'm trying to solve myself. They're not even seeing what the problems are that I'm trying to solve. And so when they give me notes, I don't find it very useful.
Are there times you have to kind of grab the bull by the horns when you see a flaw in a piece of animation, and is it tough to communicate this stuff to the people you're working with, and you have to just get in there? This is
you're talking about my own work, or talking about when I'm looking at other people's?
When you're in a collaborative space.
Yeah, it's hard. There are people who there are basically, I mean, it's obviously a gross simplification, but there's basically two types of animation artists, or professional artists in general, and probably goes across the board no matter what medium it is. But there are those who are driven by just wanting to get the job done as quickly as possible. And they're not really thinking very deeply about what they're doing, or they're not really internalizing the art part of it. They know that they have a skill which they can use to make money, and so they just want to know what you want them to do, and they just want to, follow your instructions, and they don't have any interest at all in expressing themselves through their work. And you can tell. I mean, with comic book artists, the same thing applies. There's a lot of people. I guess you kind of think of these people as hacks, but they exist. It's actually very prevalent. You don't think there are that many because you don't pay attention to them, but it's actually the majority.
Oh, for sure. Like we call them, we call it jobbers, shovelware. Yeah. Just takes up space on the rack to take the buying dollar from the other comics that are out there. I think another part of this conversation is going to be there are some parallels spiritually in terms of the practitioners between animation and comics. Does it make sense to staff your production with a couple of these kinds of carpenters, these job guys that can just do some in-betweens or something?
Well, in the case of animation, in general, the people who are doing in-betweens or cleanups, those people are generally all going to be like that. I mean, some of them may be frustrated, but if they have any kind of artistic aspirations, then they try to get out of those assisting or cleanup positions as quickly as they can. And usually, I'm good at spotting. If they're working with me, then they'll show some initiative, and they'll usually be given more creative work to do. So it's very hierarchical in that sense, especially working overseas, which is what I do a lot of. I work a lot in Korea and Japan, and in those studio systems, it's much more hierarchical. To answer your earlier question, first of all, when you're dealing with somebody like that, when you're trying to give feedback or you're trying to take notes from suggestions they make, then the first thing you do is you try to figure out what kind of an animator they are. And there are some guys that I've worked with, and no matter how much you try to get them to internalize what they're doing, it's like they're just not capable of doing it. It's just not in them. And so you have to give them very, very specific instructions, like on this frame, this guy's hand has to move like this up and hold. And it's very frustrating because what you're trying to do is you're trying to get them to draw a character expressing himself, giving a performance. They're not interested in trying to pull that out of their own gut. They just want to know, okay, on which frame, where should the hand be? When should he blink? All this kind of stuff. And like, imagine trying to direct an actor to perform by telling him, okay, on this frame, blink, turn your head, pick up this glass on this frame. I mean, it's impossible. You can't possibly get a naturalistic performance out of an actor who wants to be told exactly what to do at every frame without really internalizing the emotion. And yet, that's the way most TV animation that you see in the US is done. It's crazy. It's a system that's become so entrenched that if you ask an animator, at this point, if they can put some of their own emotion into their some of their own emotion into the animation, they'll look at you like you're asking them to do something really, really above and beyond what should be expected. Even though that's to me, that's the minimum of what they should do.
Is that something that's inherent with like the studio system? Maybe in American animation, maybe elsewhere. I was going to ask if you've worked in other countries or other systems. But is that something that you think is inherent in, say, American animation systems, where in comic books we see that. Like I think editorial and publishers don't necessarily want you to be too creative. You know, if you're working on Iron Man, they sort of want it to look a certain way, and they don't want you to rock the boat, so to speak. Do you think that's something that American animation sort of values? Like, come in and just draw.
Well, it's very different. Working in TV and working in features is very different. So in features, it's the opposite. In a way, they fetishize performance almost to excess, to the point where very often I find it difficult to watch an American animated feature because all the different scenes are trying to outdo each other, like animators showing off what they can do, and it becomes very busy. When you string all those scenes together, they look good in isolation, but you string 100 shots together of animators all trying to outdo each other, and it becomes too much. It's too rich. So I guess you don't know very much about the TV animation process, but what you do is you write down all of the directions, like all the instructions for the animator to follow on exposure sheets. And on the exposure sheets, every single line or every frame of film, and there's 24 per second, is given a line, and the director writes down for every single line, for every single frame of film, what the character is supposed to do. And if you have like 3 or 4 characters, then the sheets can be extremely complicated. And the timing directors have to guess what the animator is going to be able to manage, and so it becomes a shorthand for you guys aren't animation guys, so this is very arcane stuff, and maybe I shouldn't go into it, but
please, we could keep up, go into anything, and our audience is a lot of animators are in the audience, so yeah, don't get hung up on that at all. Our channel's built on that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, so in my experience, what you're trying to do is the person who writes the exposure sheets, and that's what they're called. They're called sheet timers. They have to look at the storyboard and see what kind of emotions or actions are demanded by the storyboard. So if in the storyboard the character has to be sad, let's say, so he's giving a line of dialogue, but he has to show that he's sad. So he's thinking, okay, well, how am I going to convey the idea that this character is sad? Well, I'm going to have him droop his head, and maybe his shoulders are going to sag. Okay, or you think of whatever physical gestures are going to indicate that they're sad, right? And you write them down, but you don't write down, but he doesn't write down that the character is sad. It just says shoulders droop, head sags. And then when the animator overseas gets that, they never see the idea that the character is sad. They only see that the shoulders are drooping, and that's what they do. And then they're never thinking about the emotion that's motivating all of that. They're just looking at the physical signs of that. So that's what I say. That's what I mean, when I say that a lot of animators, they just want to be told what to do. They don't want to have to feel what they forget what the underlying motivation is for the sheet timer for having chosen these gestures. They're just looking at the gestures.
When listening to like audio commentary tracks on things like The Simpsons, you often hear the producers just talk about how baffled they were whenever they used a different studio overseas to handle some animation, or even something as simple as like signage on a store. It would just be Roman characters, alphabet letters that you and I recognize, but strung together they don't even say a word, and things like this sometimes.
Yeah, so it's a big problem. So when I do a show, I always talk about the emotion. I don't talk about it in terms of, and when I write sheets, I'll write down like what the motivating emotion is as well. Very often, like you can do that, but still a lot of animators, won't care. They're just mechanically doing what they're, blink on frame 8, raised your hand on frame 16, that type of thing. It's a very technical and mechanical process, and for that reason, I think a lot of people get into animation because they're really fascinated by the process, and the process is very complicated and it's very technical. And I think that I used to be more fascinated by that at the beginning, but the longer I do it, I get very, very bored talking about the process. It applies to, and I guess that some of your viewers may be pissed off if I say things like this, but process is not important. So all these tutorials that I see of like artists showing how they draw, it's like, don't do that. It's like, it's not interesting. Like, I don't want to watch you draw. I don't want to see how you, manipulate your pen to create a brush stroke. It's completely unimportant, and it's a distraction. It's like, don't think that has any kind of lasting value to anybody except for process nerds.
It's that very youthful notion when you're getting started that there's a rule set or something. You have to see the way things are done, and we talk about it a lot here. You see behind us, man, there's just boxes and boxes of comics in the studio.
Yeah. And
that can program your brain in the wrong way. Like you have to deprogram yourself from a lot of that stuff. So like I see the attraction to these process videos, but I think I get what you're saying. Sometimes we'll take courses, like we took a screenwriting course, and it felt like there were all these rules which created a barrier to entry that felt like it was insurmountable to even participate.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the time, people focus on process because it's the thing that's most visible and in a way the thing that's most understandable, that's easily understandable. But when I make a film or animate a scene, like the way that I draw it it's just a means of being able to convey the idea, which is the reason why I'm creating a film. So it doesn't really matter, whether it's drawn in pencil or pen or on a tablet, as long as the idea that I'm trying to convey is then communicated to the viewer. The particular medium to me is really not the substrate. I mean, I think of it in terms of the physical substrate of the idea is completely unimportant. So if I use computer animation, if I use 2D hand-drawn animation, if I use live action for that matter.
This is that I always say there's no magic pen. I spent 10 years asking all these cartoonists I like, what do they draw with? And, at some point you realize that the tool really doesn't matter.
Well, I won't go so far as to say, I mean, technique does matter to me, okay? But the thing is, when a lot of, I also teach. I expect somebody who draws to have at least the technical skill to be able to draw in such a way that what they've drawn is not confusing or ambiguous. It's only when you get beyond that point that your work starts to become interesting. Like if you're stuck at the stage where you're talking about how to draw a hand correctly, then you shouldn't even be showing your work in public. And so many of the artists who I see, they have galleries, and I mean I don't want to piss off a lot of people, but honestly, a lot of people who are showing their work in public should not be doing it. They're not ready. Okay, get to a point where you are no longer showing off the way you draw, because quite honestly, I don't think that's that interesting. It's what you can do with your drawings, with those skills. I mean, it's in the case of drawing, I find that in general, people have a much lower threshold of what they think is an acceptable level of skill. But I think that with music, for example, there's a much higher expectation that, if you get up on a stage and you perform and you don't know how to play your instrument correctly, then the audience isn't going to stand for it. They don't tolerate that. With drawing, I see a lot of cases where people publish their work and their work just is not suitable for public display, and yet they're doing it, and people stand for it, and people should not.
There's the nerve-wracking piece. Like as a student, when I went to art school, I really thought that like I was going to be surrounded with a bunch of people with this sort of same kind of drive and had the same like sort of basic level of proficiency, because I just assumed like a kid doesn't get a basketball scholarship to learn to play basketball in college. So like, why would it be that way with the arts? And it felt that way a little bit. Now you went to Cal Arts. I imagine that there was a lot of like a high level of craft amongst your peer group there. It seems like a lot of people you went to school with went on to change animation in the 80s and forward, and some people became pretty prominent artists. You're a teacher now. Do you see a difference between the sort of general student body in terms of ability when you were in school compared to now? Is it the same? Is it different?
It's completely different. Yeah, the landscape is completely different. I mean, animation is actually a viable career these days, and a lot of people get into it. And most big schools have an animation program. Back when I was at Cal Arts, there were very few places in the world where you could study animation. Cal Arts was one of the few, and there weren't that many people. Most people didn't even know. Most general people, if you just told somebody on the street that you are doing animation, they wouldn't even know what animation was. You'd have to explain to them. And in 1979, 1980, which is when I was going to Cal Arts, there was really only a couple. There was Disney Studios that was producing animation. They were only making like one animated movie every 5 years. And then there was Bakshi, and I did my first job working with him. And then there was TV animation, but a lot of those studios were closing down at the time. And if you were going to Cal Arts studying animation, I mean, it was an exciting time because, as you said, a lot of the people that I did go to school with ended up, changing the whole like revitalizing the animation industry. But it wasn't a very realistic thing to pursue as a career, not like today. Ironically, though, it meant that in both cases you had a lot of students who were not really who don't really belong in an animation program. In the 80s, because there were so few people who were interested in studying it, that they would take a lot of students who shouldn't qualify. And today they just a lot of people, I think, start deciding that they're going to get into animation without realizing how difficult it is. And so the problem I see right now is that a lot of students underestimate. And so a lot of them drop out after they realize how difficult it actually is. And especially the way I teach, which is I don't coddle my students. And they appreciate that, actually. The ones who are good, they're surprised when I criticize their work, because they say, well, you're actually giving me criticism which they can use. A lot of professors don't do that, especially at a school like USC. Yeah, they just expect to be told that everything they're doing is fine and keep doing what they're doing.
I wanted to just spend another minute or so on the process versus idea. Was this something when you started in animation? Were you more on the process side? Did something happen, or have you always been about just the idea as being the most important?
I've always
part?
no, I've never been a process person. I mean, inevitably, I think when you're younger and you're starting out, you're more focused on understanding the process, and so you're going to be inevitably somewhat focused on that. But I was never about the process. From the beginning, I always wanted to use my animation as a means of well, this is a completely different topic, and this is very interesting. But as an artist, you're constantly trying to justify what you're doing, because I think that the public perception is that drawing or art or filmmaking is somehow non-essential, that it's somehow a luxury, and in that sense, you're constantly trying to justify what you're doing, because you're saying, well, why don't you do something useful, like be a doctor or a lawyer or something? It's like, why? What is all this animation stuff? And so early on, I see this with a lot of young people getting into the business, and so they're very involved in this debate over, well, what is it we're doing? Like, what is the purpose of making animated films? It gets defined in this very kind of arbitrary dichotomy of, some people want to define it as entertainment, and I don't like using that word, but that it's commonly talked about in terms of, are you trying to entertain, or are you trying to deliver some kind of message, or are you trying to teach? And I mean, people say they want to use their we had this debate at CalArts, like the teachers wanted to know if we were just trying to entertain, or if we were trying to deliver a message. The students, the faculty at CalArts at the time, who were all Disney people, they said, like, forget about trying to deliver a message. It's for entertainment. Now, myself, I never looked at that as a real dichotomy, because what you're talking about is, when people say entertainment, like, what they really mean is, what they mean when they say that is, they mean escapism. Because entertainment is actually the wrong word. Entertainment is not a goal. Like, it's wrong to say that the purpose of making a film, or the purpose of going to see a film, is to be entertained. That is not the goal. Entertainment is a means. So whether your purpose or your goal is to provide escapism or to deliver a message, you're always going to try to make it entertaining, or in other words, engaging to your audience. Those two things are not exclusive to each other, because in order to effectively deliver a message, you have to be entertaining. I mean, the words that I use are escapism and didacticism. So, delivering a message is to be didactic. And I'm not interested in doing either one of those things. I'm not interested in escapism or didacticism. And I don't think that an artist's role is to be didactic. I don't think that an artist has any great authority to be able to teach either moral messages or political messages.
A lot of propaganda artwork out there these days, man.
Yeah, and a lot of bad art, tries to get by having good intentions. And
that's a good way to put
it. I know I'm going to piss off some people, but like, I used to love Art Spiegelman when he was doing stuff like Arcade, but when he did Mouse, like, the art went, like, as far as I'm concerned, became much less interesting, and it was really about the good intentions. And I know you talked about Mouse on your show, but that's a good example of that. yeah, I just see a lot of artists, you know, using the excuse of of their politics, or or their moralizing, as a way to produce mediocre art.
It's a real, we call it a cheap pop, man. You get the cheap pop by sort of catering to that crowd. You put a
Yeah,
piece out on Twitter or something, you'll get more retweets or something than
yeah.
putting out something a little bit more, from the
I
from the
think I
gut or
think that
something.
in a way, AEON FLUX was kind of a reaction against that, actually, because I think if you can manage to what's the word? I mean, anytime you talk about art, you end up sounding very pretentious and highfalutin, because it's really hard to
We're all
talk
among
about
friends here. It's
artistic
all good, man.
ambition.
Safe
It's really
territory.
it's hard to talk about artistic ambition without sounding self-aggrandizing. Art to me is much more about, well, okay, so I said that I'm not interested in escapism and I'm not interested in didacticism. So what am I interested in? So that could very well be your question. So
I was just about to ask.
but all art is, and I'll start by saying this, is that art is not a luxury, okay? So there are certain things that everybody needs in society to survive and to live. And one is, you need food, you need shelter, you need clothing, but you also need communication. And that's what art is. Art is communication. And to me, what communication is what you're trying to do is you have an intended meaning, or a way of understanding that you are trying to impart to another person. That's the purpose of communication. So you understand something, you want the other person to understand what you understand. You want to share that understanding, okay? And by understanding, one way of defining that is that you see a particular meaning in either an event or a phenomenon or an object. And it's when you discover meaning in something in life. For me, that's what triggers the impulse to communicate. And whether it's communicating through art, or communicating through just a daily conversation, or communicating to your students, or communicate to my child. It's like, so what you're trying to do as an artist is that you're trying to give that experience of discovering meaning that you had, but you're not doing it by a means of exposition. You're giving it, and that's why I describe film as an experiential medium. It's not a visual medium, it's an experiential medium. And I differentiate that between a film and, let's say, a book. When you read a story in a book, that is not an experiential medium. It's a symbolic medium, because words do not give you an experience of the senses. What you're doing is the extent that you're using your power of sight, your vision, is to recognize symbols written on a page, and then there's a decoding process going on when you read a word which is a symbol of a real thing. Film, in that sense, is much more like experiencing an event the way you do in real life, in the sense that you're experiencing it through your senses, and whatever meaning you gain from that experience is a process of inference. If you use a lot of words to explain an event, the meaning of an event, then you're using exposition as your means of conveying meaning. So we all learn in English class that there are two basic ways of understanding the meaning of a word. One is that you can look it up in the dictionary, and the other way you can understand it is through its context. You can see how it's used in context. So when you're making a film, always use context. don't use exposition, okay? Because an example that I use, there's a lot of examples that I use, but it really pisses me off when I'm watching a movie and a character says to another character, "I love you," for example. It's very common. Don't do that. Like, I'm just, in order for me to understand that this character loves that character, it's like I need to be able to infer it through what they're doing, but don't tell me, okay? Once you tell me, it's like you've explained the joke. Like, don't explain the joke and it's not funny, okay? And if you tell me that person A loves person B, then I just have to kind of take your word for it, but I'm not feeling it. I'm not feeling the emotion, okay? And also don't tell me that you have to do something, that it's urgent for you to do something. Don't do that. So that's explaining the joke. Like, I need to be able to feel it. I need to be able to infer it through context. And that's what filmmaking is. Filmmaking is about creating a context for the audience to understand, to gain understanding.
So fascinating to hear that, because I'm thinking about AEON FLUX and my favorites of the episodes and things, and how in the hands of somebody else, how it could have turned into propaganda material or exposition, or spoon feeding us a lot of ideas in terms of good and bad. There's a lot of ambiguity in AEON FLUX. Specifically, I'm thinking about there's like two cities, Monica, Bregna. There's an episode where people are trying to cross the border, and there's a clear like kind of DMZ, like no-go zone, and AEON can sneak back and forth no problem. If it was anybody else, if it was any other kind of animation or TV for that matter, we would know what the good side is, what the bad side is. There would be a reason that you would want to go over. Like, there would just be all of this spoon feeding that was done, and that is one of the things that really fascinates me about AEON FLUX, because the general audience, we see it a lot with book reviews, and you see it sometimes in the more adventurous films. They will not spell out who's the good character. Like, the audience wants to identify with the character. They need to know who the antagonist and protagonist is. AEON FLUX didn't do that, and it was the 90s. I feel like I would almost be shocking now, but I can't even imagine how something like that can get sold in the 90s.
One of the few places that ran a review in like a newspaper was the Los Angeles Times, and they accused the creator, the author, me, of being lazy because I hadn't figured out who was good and who was bad, and who was the hero and who was the villain. And that was the entire point. It's like, you're supposed to be able to watch the show and look at, in each instance, contextually, oh, well, this character is doing this, which results in that, and therefore, they're actually doing something. I mean, I'll use these words, but they're the villain or they're the hero in this particular story, because it's not going to be the same, and I'm never going to tell you, like, and that's much closer to the way things are in real life. It's like anybody is capable of doing the right thing or the wrong thing, depending on the circumstance, and very often in the case of AEON FLUX, I was very deliberately putting the characters in situations where they had to do something bad in the process of trying to achieve something good in the end. And that's always that's the constant moral dilemma that you always face, is that, like, are you going to do this little bad thing in order to achieve this greater good thing? And is the possibility that you might fail, is it worth it? Because sometimes in the case of AEON FLUX, it's like she will have to do something bad in order to do something that for her is going to be a greater good, but sometimes she fails.
Even as a kid, watching the Liquid Television stuff, watching AEON FLUX like run down a corridor, shoot down some soldiers, I'm conditioned by American comic books. Clearly, she's the hero. Like, I don't know what an AEON Flux is. It's, it's an overarching thing, but, this is clearly the hero. Cuts down a soldier, gurgling in a puddle of blood. Another soldier comes over, takes off her mask, and this is a couple. These are human beings.
Yeah.
You never see underneath the helmet of a Star Wars stormtrooper, and that really got me to sort of pay attention a little bit more, because I was conditioned on the old way, the common way, I guess, and it was confusing but really, really captivating. And then as you get older, you keep watching this stuff, it just is bringing about even more ideas. It's really thoughtful, and I can't think of another piece of animation that I could consider to be adult in America. Really, I can't think of a second one, but like somewhere in this conversation, I do want to hear some recommendations, because there were some good ones in interviews that you've done, and I went off and checked some of that stuff out.
Peter, was AEON Flux the first time that you really found, like an outlet for your communication in your animation art? Like up to that point, were you frustrated by your experiences in animation?
Yeah, well, actually, that's not quite the case. I started out after working with Bakshi. I went to work at Disney, and I was lucky in the sense that I wasn't just working as a staff artist on some big animated production. I was put in development, so I was writing and designing stuff. I mean, people probably know this already, but you should know that most of the projects that are developed at a big studio like Disney's, they don't ultimately get produced. And so I was there for 2 years, and I worked on several projects. Nothing that I ever worked on actually made it into production. But I enjoy the development process and creating something from scratch. And so, in a sense, I was given the opportunity to have that outlet of, doing something that was personally fulfilling creatively, but the fact that nothing ever got actually made, was frustrating in the end. And so, in that sense, I didn't actually get to express myself. I don't think that I was ready. It was kind of a strange time to be at Disney Studios. They were still trying to figure out what they were going to be doing going forward. And they had a strategy where they would take young animators straight out of CalArts, which is what I was at the time, and they would kind of let them go wild and see if they came up with anything. And, at the time, Tim Burton was there, and he was kind of in the same boat. And he's so prolific that he ended up, they actually ended up producing some of his stuff, like his Hansel and Gretel episode. But John Lasseter was there, and Henry Selick was there. I worked with Henry Selick for a brief time over at Disney. But then I left Disney, and then I went to work for Marvel, and so that's when I started working on Transformers. And I just wanted because working at Disney, I just worked in development and had no production experience. I wanted a lot of production experience, and so working on something like Transformers on a TV show where you have a tight schedule, and it's just the opposite of working at a place like Disney. It's like everything that you produce is going to get used and get reused, actually. You can't produce enough. Like they need so much that I was doing like double duty, like doing even though you're not supposed to I'm trying to remember if it was a union job, but I ended up doing designs and storyboards and overseas supervision. That's when I realized that I needed to become a director, because working on storyboards, like I would put to address your question, I was putting a lot of my own ideas about how something should be conveyed into my storyboards. But then, as a storyboard artist, as a young storyboard artist, you're working for a director, and so the director ultimately takes your storyboards and decides, okay, well, we don't need this. I don't understand this, so I cut it out. And all the stuff that I really wanted to put into it, that really expressed my own view, would not be understood or be thought of as being confusing or unnecessary, and they would inevitably cut those things out. And so when I did AEON Flux, it was a chance for me to do all the things that everybody always told me that I couldn't do. And it was there was absolutely nobody telling me what I couldn't do, especially with the Liquid TV on Fluxes. And it was very gratifying because all the stuff that I thought was going to work, actually worked when I put it on the screen.
It's such a cool description of like getting to do all the stuff that you were told you couldn't do. That's kind of an amazing. It sounds so good. It sounds too good to be true. Peter, were you surprised by that? I mean, was there any sign, like, the first 10 years of your career that this might exist? Like there might be outlets where you can just do the things that, most places wouldn't let you do? That sounds amazing, like a playground or something that you found.
I think that when you're young, thinking back on it now, I should have been, but at the time when you're young and you're just, you feel like you're capable of anything. It's like, I wasn't surprised, but I did recognize it as a great opportunity. And so I was not concerned about going over budget or spending my own money, which is something that I did. And other people working on Liquid TV thought that I was crazy to be putting that much work on something that was low budget. But guess what? It's like my career took off after that, and a lot of those guys.
There's only two things that you remember from Liquid Television in a big way. It's Beavis and Butthead and it's AEON Flux.
Yeah, and Beavis and Butthead wasn't actually made for Liquid
right.
Television. It was acquired, so it had already existed as a short film. But yeah. I mean, it was very low budget, but the fact that they were just going to allow you to do whatever you wanted, it was, and you were going to have 1 million people seeing your work every week. It's like. I couldn't pay to have an opportunity like that. That's one thing that I tell my students these days, which is that I think that a lot of times, because there were a lot of animators working on Liquid Television, doing their own little 2-minute segments. And I think that for a lot of people in that situation, they kind of want to hang on to their best stuff because they don't think that it's worth it to give away. And what I tell young animators is, don't be stingy like that. When the opportunity comes, always give your best, and don't worry about, I'm not going to have anything later on. When a better opportunity comes, you will have. If you're a creative person, you will come up with something.
It's super cool thinking about that Liquid Television as a professional setting, where sort of what you're describing is an art school scenario that I've seen and experienced plenty of times, where there's this arbitrary idea of like grades, and you have an assignment or something, and you're getting the same grade as somebody else who might have hacked their piece out. But if you go above and beyond, now you have a portfolio piece that you can use in the future, and it could springboard into something bigger. You just have to put all that as much extra work in as possible. Now, you mentioned a budget for AEON Flux, the shorts specifically. These things are scored with beautiful, like, orchestral music. Is this where, I mean, I feel, knowing nothing about film production or anything like that, was that like a big chunk of the budget? Like, is there some canned tunes that can be used for something like that?
No, see, the music was done by my friend Drew Newman, who also went to Cal Arts. He was an animation student at Cal Arts when I was there, and he happened to have musical ability, so all the students went to him to get their soundtracks. But yeah, I was blown away when I first heard the score that he came up with, because it did sound like an orchestra, but he does it all himself, and it was just as low budget. So, but he had the same attitude. It's funny that you bring that up because I just finished putting together we're putting together a soundtrack box set, which is being released for the first time. The soundtrack to AEON FLUX had never been released before, not officially anyway. So he had the same attitude that I did. It was just a great opportunity to do all the things that he wanted to do, and so he was not motivated by the need to make money at the time. I mean, he was young, and so was I at the time, so we didn't have a lot of expenses, so we were willing to do that. I'm not sure I'd be willing to do it now, but at the time, my advice to young people getting started is, don't think that a better opportunity is going to come later. It's like, always give them your best. I don't know if that answers your question. But
if you're untested, you pretty much have to give that first one away or whatever. Renegotiate a contract with your second book or whatever.
Yeah, because the thing is, you're going against people who are also, trying to get that spot on the broadcast schedule, who are going to be willing to give away more. So that's kind of the wrong way to put it, but at the beginning, it'll pay off better in the end if you are willing to give up something just to get your work shown. I mean, to me, it's priceless. So you may think that you're giving up this valuable, precious thing that is your idea, that your creative idea, but at the same time, it's like, being given a a time slot on a TV network, is something you can't pay,
and just to add a little context to the people at home, our demographic can skew young sometimes. There were 30 channels on the television at the time when Liquid Television was coming out. There was very limited opportunity, and there was almost zero goose egg freaking subversive kind of material. This was a big deal.
Yeah. Right now the landscape is completely different. So I have an original new adult series that I'm trying to get made, but right now everybody is doing it. Like all of the different networks are trying to do adult animation. It's some of it. I thought Arcane is well done. I don't know if you've been following that. So that's why I got onto social media, was to try to get some interest in supporting the kind of work that I'm trying to get produced.
Well, and let's boost some eyeballs to that, man. What's your Instagram? What other social media platforms do you have?
Well, I'm just on Instagram for now. I mean, I avoided social media for years, just because I just saw it as a huge time suck, but which it is. But at the same time, I think that maybe I came in at a good moment, because I have a lot of backlog of archived material which nobody has seen, and it's hard to get a lot of this stuff published because other people own the rights to a lot of it. But Instagram being free, I'm not making money off of it, so in a sense, there's a lot of license you have to be able to show work that you've done in a way that didn't exist before. And so I'm still trying to figure it out, but I'm finding that it's a good way of keeping interest in your work alive and generating interest in what you may be doing coming up.
It's real fun seeing the parallels between the sort of animation business and the comic book business in terms of, you know, just some spiritual ideas and things. And in comics, you would hear about guys like Frank Miller, Scott McCloud, people who were becoming acquainted with manga pretty early, and this kind of resistance that that the people of, you know, American comics, the way that they would bristle at that kind of idiom or aesthetic or storytelling sensibility. And I wonder, like, did you find anime early, and what was that like to, you know, what does a Disney animator think of, you know, some sort of anime?
It sort of touches on what you were asking me earlier about was I surprised to be able to have the license to do whatever I wanted when I did Liquid TV. And the fact is that, so I grew up all over the place. My father was a diplomat, so I was exposed to comics and animation from all over the place, like European comics, Japanese comics, Korean comics. Even though at the time when I was growing up, there were far more Japanese comics. And then Japanese animation. I grew up on Japanese animation while living in Korea as a kid, and there was a lot of Japanese animation that I was exposed to, and which were my favorite kinds. Well, I'll say this. I mean, like all kids, you grow up with Disney animation and Warner Brothers and Bugs Bunny and all of that, but I never regarded that as something that I could do because it's so polished and the craft is, you know, I mean, I can go off on a whole other, there's this whole other talk that I could give about classical animation versus Japanese animation. But the reason why I think that a lot of young artists gravitate towards Japanese animation is that it's not as polished, in the sense that you can see that it's made up of drawings and that it's drawn by people. Whereas the ideal when it comes to classical, like Disney style, like character animation, is that the whole goal with that kind of animation is to completely erase any trace that what you're looking at is a drawing. So when you look at Mickey Mouse or you look at Bugs Bunny, like those are living beings. They're living, like, quote, people who exist, who have their own independent life and existence. The Japanese sensibility is completely different. It's much more modernist in that sense. So, you know, it's the difference between classical art and modern art. So the idea in classicism, like with classicist painting, is that you hide the technique in order to elevate the subject. So if you look at, you know, and all this happened obviously before photography, and photography kind of changed everything, and that's when modernism started in Western art. You know, it's funny because a lot of students actually don't have this art history, and I kind of wonder with a lot of like young artists getting into comics and so forth. But you know, when you look at a portrait of Napoleon, you're not supposed to admire the technique of the artist. You're supposed to admire Napoleon, how great Napoleon is. So that's what I mean. So the classicist painters painted things like scenes out of the Bible or classical mythology, and you're supposed to admire or current events sometimes, like important historical events. Like they would use their paintings as a way of recording that because they didn't have photography. And a famous painter would create the official kind of record of a historical event, you know, whether it's a coronation or some kind of a disaster or anything. And what, you know, so if you look at a painting like the Raft of the Medusa, you're not really supposed to be admiring the technique of the artist. You're supposed to be touched by the heroism of the people on the life raft. And then when you went to modernism, the subject matter was not important at all. It was all about technique and the brushstroke. And so when you look at Monet and he's painting, haystacks and people on the street, it's like they're not important subjects at all. It's just it's the act of painting that you're supposed to admire and appreciate. And in that sense, you could say that it's a more what they would have defined it this way, is that it was more honest, because with classicism you're trying to create an illusion that you're looking at something real, even though it's made up of brushstrokes, but you're trying to hide the brushstrokes. And I compare that to classical animation, where like the Disney ideal is that you're never supposed to see the drawings. You blend the drawings in such a way that you don't know where one drawing ends and the next one begins, and it has to be seamless. In the same way that you should never, in classical painting, notice the brush strokes, because you're just supposed to see the subject. So in classical animation, you're trying to create an illusion of life. You're trying to make the audience believe that Pinocchio is a real living boy, or puppet in this case. And Japanese animation is, it follows the tradition of Japanese art, which never had a tradition of classicism. Japanese art is all about the brushstroke, and it's all about the flat, two-dimensional nature of the picture plane. And for that reason, I think that a lot of modern, like Western modernist artists, when they saw Japanese prints for the first time, they were, they said, yeah, this is it. This is what painting should be. And so, they were big fans of Asian art. But I think that a lot of animation fans, they need to understand the difference between Japanese animation, having come out of a tradition, which by a Western definition is modernist, because traditional Japanese painting is by a Western definition. People need to not be confused by the label modern, because modern does not mean contemporary.
Right.
Modern means it's a departure from classicism. That's what makes something modern. And it's the appreciation of the artist's process as opposed to the subject matter. And it applies to all different media. It applies to writing. I mean, you can what a modernist writer is somebody whose main subject is the voice of the writer, not the subject of his fictional characters.
Would it have been Japanese animation that attracted you to the medium in the first place, or were you here in the States at that point? Did you see, I don't know, Bambi meets Godzilla? Like I can't imagine, like, you have so many ideas.
This is what I'm saying is that when you of course I loved watching Bambi and Pinocchio and all the classic, but those things just seem so far beyond what I could be capable of doing that I never thought of becoming an animator to do that. When I looked at Japanese animation, and there's a particular show which never made it to the States, it's called Tiger Mask, but I remember as a kid watching it, but it was about a professional wrestler, and it was drawn in this very rough kind of gestural drawing style, and it had a low frame rate, and you could really see that it was the handiwork of somebody sitting at the desk and drawing it, and that felt like it was within reach, and it felt like, oh well, I could do that, or I should try to do that. And so I think that for a lot of and I see it today with a lot of young people wanting to get into animation, is that they're inspired by a lot of the Japanese animation that they see, precisely for that reason. I don't know if that answers your question, but
when
yeah,
AEON Flux was on in the TV I had in my bedroom, it was like 15-inch,
Right.
black and white, and I remember like I thought that the animation was so slick. What I would do is videotape liquid television, pause it frame by frame, and if you remember those old cathode ray tube televisions, a lot of static. You could put a piece of paper up on the TV and it would just stick there. And I was tracing off these characters. Like I really thought that I was going to go into animation until I realized like I don't know anything about the business of it. It seems like there's like comics is democratic in that you sit down, you make the thing, you could send it, a clear place to send it, get a thumbs up, thumbs down. Seems like there's like a lot of barriers to entry to get to participate in animation. Like I'm imagining everybody has to go through school, right? Like
no, actually, that's not true. Some of the best animators that I know never went to art school and never studied animation formally. They just did it. It's funny, like a lot of artists, and I'm sure, with a lot of comic book artists, a lot of them are self-taught. And if you're good, you're going to get good whether you went to school or not. And I know a lot of, the flip side of that is I know a lot of people who spent a lot of time in art school, but who never made it, were never able to have a career.
would you buy like pre-punched paper with the little Ames guide thing to the pegboard
No,
when you were a kid doing flip books or
So
something?
when I first started animation, actually, I didn't have access to things like that, and I went to high school on the East Coast, and um, I started making animated films when I was 16. So, and I was shooting them on Super 8 film. This is way before video recorders, and so I just used typing paper. So, like I would use paper like this, and I would just line up the edges without any kind of registration pins, and that was close enough. It's actually what Winsor McKay did when he was doing Gertie the Dinosaur. Is that you would just line up you just need two sides, like one corner, to line up. And then when I went to Cal Arts, no, they made us punch our own paper. That we had hole like professional hole punch for animation use. So and then I ended up buying one of those.
Those things are like $900.
I bought one used from somebody who was getting rid of his, so I did pretty well.
What were your 16-year-old films like? Like how complex would these things be in terms of subject matter and say runtime? 30
Very
seconds?
complex, very complex. The reason being is that I like to move the camera, and without a proper camera stand, like you can't really create camera moves by panning artwork. So I had to draw all my camera moves. So not only would I move the camera side to side and up and down, but I would move it along the z-axis. So, a lot of what I did, and that was kind of the signature, I guess, style, you could say, that, made my work stand out from a lot of my Cal Arts peers, is that I would do a lot of hand-drawn camera moves.
I'm really fascinated by this. Like, have you been keeping up with media? Like, did you digitize it to tape later? Is it on DVD? Can we see this on Instagram at some point?
Well, I still have the drawings, but all of that was shot on 8mm, and I may have a 16mm print of it somewhere, but like, good luck trying to find a 16mm projector or moviola. A lot of that stuff, I'm fine if it never ever sees the light of day.
It's interesting that you were doing that as a teenager, because I feel like that's such a big part of AEON Flux, and what we see there with the motion of both characters and camera. So it's kind of cool that that's been a part of your work from the beginning.
Yeah, well, one thing that one reason why I'd like working overseas, actually, I'll put it that way. I don't know how this, but one thing that's frustrating about working in animation in the U.S. is that, especially in the union system, the way the labor is divided up in the union is that you're not allowed to do everything. And so if you draw characters, you have to draw characters. If you draw backgrounds, you have to draw backgrounds. If you draw effects, you have to draw effects. And I like integrating all different elements of the picture together. So I think of them as, I don't think of backgrounds and characters as separate elements, visual elements, that they have to work together. So no, I'm glad you noticed that, because that's a big part of what I try to do. It's that, like, I try to make use of every bit of visual information in every frame to contribute to what I'm trying to say.
Because you brought up unions, I am sort of curious about this, and numbers don't matter in any way, but character designer for Rugrats, does the union take care of you in terms of licensing? Like, every time there's a Tommy Pickles McDonald's toy, like, do you get taken care of?
No.
You guys need to make me your labor leader.
Coming from a guy whose industry has no unions.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, well, it's been a big issue for a long time, and I don't know where things stand right now with. I mean, animation has become the demand for it and the market for it has become great enough that creators these days can sometimes negotiate better deals, outside of the union restrictions. So if you're a big enough name, so usually what they give you is some percentage of merchandising. But who knows? How accurately you're going to all of that's going to get accounted for.
If we're talking a little bit of the commercial side of this, one thing that struck me, Peter, is looking at some of the links that you shared with us, is a lot of commercial work that you've done. How does that fit in sort of your career in terms of creativity? Do you enjoy doing those? And by commercials, I mean like 30-second spots, things like that.
Yeah, I think it's important. I look at it this way: like, if you do a commercial for like a national ad campaign for a product like Pepsi, or I've done spots for Honda and for Jaguar and for Sony TVs, and so these are big brand names, and you get, for one thing, you get national exposure. And so the great thing for me about animated commercials is that everybody sees them. Whereas an animated TV program, if a viewer is not interested in watching animation, they're not going to tune into it, so they'll never see it. But an animated TV commercial, everybody's going to see it. And so I always see that as an opportunity to expand the audience for animation, because if you can show in a national advertising spot a kind of animation that people didn't expect to see or have not seen before, then you're exposing them to something that expands their perception of what animation can do. And to me, that's very important as a way of being able to expand the audience and expand the minds of the existing audience to become receptive to different kinds of animation, which is always good. the other aspect of it, which I like, is that compared to working on a TV show, um, you have a better budget and a schedule, so it enables you um, to hone your craft and to polish your technique to a degree which you are not going to have the chance to on a TV show. So you can produce a small concentrated amount of very polished animation on a technical level, and that's good practice as well. So,
Do you find a little more creative freedom with with one of these brands compared to, say, I don't know, doing a feature?
It's a challenge. I actually it's really difficult to do. Like, if there's 30-second spot, very often, you might have 15 or 20 seconds of that will be animation, and then there'll be like a 10-second tag with the logo and the product or something. And to try to tell a story, or to try to convey an idea or a concept in 15 or 20 seconds is a really huge challenge, in a way that's, that creates a flow and creates a lasting impression. And it teaches you to be efficient, and it teaches you to be strict in terms of getting rid of anything superfluous, and to communicate with impact and strength.
Taking a look at the filmography here, got the Animatrix, Chronicles of Riddick, two flicks that I would say borrow a little something from AEON Flux. So when they get this opportunity to do this animated piece, man, and they hire Peter Chung, clearly they want Peter Chung to be Peter Chung. Or did they give you a lot of creative freedom to do your contributions, or did they want that AEON Flux aesthetic, but they had very specific ideas about how they wanted that to look in the final product?
Well, Animatrix was a very special case because originally I was not part of the original plan, and so they had the Wachowskis' idea was that they would explore some of the backstories or some of the side stories to some of the characters from the original Matrix movie. So they had several episodes of the Animatrix which were supposed to give you some more of the backstory to the world and also to some of the characters. But then by the time that I became involved, they had already kind of satisfied that need. And so they told me that I could do whatever I wanted, basically. And so I was lucky in that sense. But some of the other directors did not have that freedom. I came in very late because what happened was one of the other Japanese directors was, for some reason, I don't remember exactly why, but they had to, there was some kind of a conflict and they had to leave the project. And so there was an opening. And so I made a call when I heard that some of my friends from Madhouse in Japan were working on Animatrix, and I wanted in on it. And so I called up Warner Brothers. I happened to know a producer of it, Warner Brothers. I just gave him a call just out of the blue and said, "Hey, I'd like to be involved in this." And at first the answer was, "Well, we're already staffed up. Every episode has been accounted for." And so I felt like, oh, well, I don't get to go to the ball. And so I was kind of let it go at that. And then about a month later, or maybe it was like a couple of weeks later, it's like they called me back and they said, "Oh, you get to go to the ball after all," because this other person dropped out. So I met with the Wachowskis. And the thing is, I knew from having watched the first Matrix that they had seen AEON Flux. I mean, there's a very direct kind of quote, I guess you could put it that way, when they stick that insect through Keanu Reeves's belly button, it goes inside him. I mean, that's a straight lift from one of the AEON FLUX episodes. So and then with the character Trinity, what I found out was that they had originally wanted to bring me on, but they had no way of contacting me. And so when I called them, like, they said, "Oh yeah, well, let's bring him on." And so they were very busy with making Matrix 2 and 3 at the time, and so at the same time they were being very secretive about where the story was going. And the people who worked on the Animatrix, they only had access to the first movie, and so I had to imagine what Matrix 2 and 3 were going to be like. And so I saw it as a chance to create my own sequel to The Matrix, and how I wanted to see the story go. And so my episode of the Animatrix is, it's kind of, I don't know if you want to go into all of this, but yes.
Yeah, yes.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, all of it, everything.
Okay, so I mean, honestly, I'd rather talk about the conceptual side rather than the technical side, because the process side. But so the original Matrix movie is based on the premise that you can fool the human mind into believing that a simulation is real, right? But it seems like it would work the other way even better, because an artificial mind is even more susceptible to being convinced that a simulation is real than a natural human mind. And in fact, if you look at, for example, they use computer simulations to simulate war scenarios and things like that. And as far as the computer is concerned, it's a real war that's happening, and they're trying to create predictions and what's the word? Anyway, they're playing it out as if it's a real thing that's happening. So it seems like the best weapon that the humans would have to fight against the machines is to convince the machines by putting them into a simulation that would make them confuse virtual reality with reality, because to an artificial mind, all reality is virtual. It's actually one of the lines in the film. So that was the basic premise of it, and I was kind of disappointed that the movies didn't go in that direction. But
there's some fan theories that this next movie is going to go in that direction, actually. Yeah. There's a lot of talk online that, because a lot of people shared in this idea with you, that was the talk of the net, that it was this full artificial experience. So we'll have to see in December whenever that one comes out.
Peter, you've been teaching since 2013, so I did want to ask you a little bit about your experience as a teacher. And I'm curious, once again, from a creative, artistic standpoint, what do you get out of the teaching experience?
Well, one thing good about teaching students is that they're much more receptive, and they're paying money to be at university and to learn. So you can actually teach them. Whereas I find that it's much more difficult to teach professional colleagues. I can give them all kind of advice and say, well, you should do it this way, or this is a better way to direct a scene like this. But usually they don't listen, and they're not, or they'll listen and they'll nod their head, but they won't think that it applies to them for some reason. I make my students do assignments. So a lot of my teaching is, it's not just me theorizing and talking about how they should do things. I tell them Like I give them weekly assignments and they have to actually do them. They have to put it into practice. And a lot of what I teach is stuff that, well, all of it, I should say, not, I mean, it's all stuff that I've learned through trying to do myself, trying to make films myself. So there's a lot of things that you realize that, you have these epiphany moments, working day to day, trying to solve problems as you're making a film. And I try to break those down and turn them into lessons and teaching moments. So it's an opportunity for me to feel like that knowledge that I've acquired over decades of practicing my craft is not going to get lost, that somehow it's going to get imparted to another generation. Of course, they're going to all interpret it differently, and I expect them to do that, but they're going to internalize it differently and make use of it in a way that makes sense for them, and that's as it should be. But there are basic principles which I consider very, very basic that any director should know, and any skills that any director should have. What surprised me working professionally is that directors don't talk about this stuff. Very often, they're not aware of this stuff, and it's shocking to me actually when I see a commercially released feature film by a big studio, and the director somehow doesn't have the skills, which I think are very basic to to anybody who wants to call themselves a director. I'm not going to name names, or I do in class. I can I have a lot of examples, both
talk
positive,
for about 10 minutes when we turn this record button off. Peter, is it as simple, is it stuff like simple things like 180-degree rule and fundamentals that?
No. I'm talking about stuff that's way beyond that.
Okay, good.
Yeah. No, I mean, directors know that you should do that. I mean, things like there are some simple things which I still see, especially with animation. Like a lot of people don't understand the need to cut on action, for example. They'll cut from a static frame to a static frame, and you should never do that. It's like you always cut in the middle of somebody moving, and that'll, you can violate the 180-degree line also, and the way to do that is to cut on action. If you cut on action, then that's going to hide the fact that you crossed the line. And I do that. But one thing that I see, I'll just mention a couple of things. I'll mention some of the simpler things. Some of the more difficult things would take a long time. They take an hour to go into. But one thing that I see a lot in Japanese animation, I never see it in American animation, especially American TV animation, is that when they move the camera is always on the subject, on the character that's moving. You shouldn't do that. That's boring. Okay, so you can move the camera, like if your character is moving this way, then try moving the camera this way on a different path, and it solves a lot of problems that having to do with continuity and hookup. And it also, other advantages is that it compresses time. The other thing it does is it expands the world outside of the frame, because very often the problem with animation is that you're so focused on the subject that you don't get a sense of there being a wider world outside of the picture frame. So one thing that a lot of American animation directors, and I'm talking about TV animation directors now, is that they don't appreciate the value of negative space. And it's very important to include shots of nothing to create emphasis. Because if you have an important shot of somebody's close-up of them registering some kind of emotion, let's say, and that's a very key frame that you want to have, that you want to make sure that it has a lot of impact. That's always going to have more impact if you precede it with a shot of nothing, nothing important, like a blank sky, or the problem with a lot of American animation that I see is that everything is a climax, like, and when everything is a climax, nothing is a climax, and they're always on the characters' faces all the time. When I was doing AEON FLUX for MTV, doing the half-hour show, their broadcast standards and practices gave me this was their worst note, which was that, and I'm trying to remember, I think it applied only to female characters. And of course, AEON FLUX being the main character is female, is that they would never allow a shot of just a body part that did not include the head, because they thought that was objectifying. So you couldn't just have her, like, I would want to have like a camera angle, like, with her legs in the foreground. And they said, no, you can't do that. Like, her head has to be in the shot. So anyway,
Peter, this gets into sort of what I brought up at the very beginning, where through this conversation, like, you have a lot of ideas, a lot of opinions. You're a singular creator attracted to this medium that requires all this other input, like creatively, like a lot of movie directors. John Waters has photography, Scorsese does photography. Like, are there some things that you do without any other input? Or is the collaboration part of the attraction of your practice?
Well, that's a strange question for me. I don't think of it in those terms.
It's a question coming from we sit here in our little rooms all by ourselves, and we don't answer to anybody. You know what I mean? Yeah. So like working with anybody or having somebody tell us you can't have this kind of camera angle or whatever, like, it's just a different notion.
Well, no, I mean, I don't enjoy getting notes from, standards and practices or from executives, and like network executives, but I have learned to be more skillful in negotiating, maybe navigating is the word, studio notes. So I don't take it personally, when somebody tells me don't do that or do it differently. I see it as a prompt to do better, and very often you can address the note without giving up the thing that you wanted to do, but by just doing it in a way that is going to be more accessible, and in a way, to me, that's a win-win. It makes it better, and your audience is going to like it better.
Is there a little bit of politics that goes into that? I'm thinking about episode of AEON FLUX where a lady tries to cross the border and she gets that little thing in her spine that Trevor has to dig in her back, and very sexual. And I think in the audio commentary track on the DVD, like, your first go is Trevor has his tongue in there. Like, you get standards of practice to turn that one down so you can have him like finger in her little back hole and have an orgasm. Like, is that? Can we be honest?
Well, they didn't let us put him put his finger in.
Oh yeah, it's like tools.
Yeah. They said he can't put his finger in. He has to use instruments. which to me is like even more, it's more sadistic. I mean, like, but the funny thing about that, I don't know if I put this on the commentary, but the weirdest thing about that note was that they said that when we were recording her voice track, they said that she can sound like she's in distress or in pain, but she cannot sound like she's enjoying herself. That note blew me away, because they had no problem with the violence. They had a problem with the sex. So for the DVD, I put the sexual sound back in. It wasn't there on the broadcast version, and I hope that nobody remembers the broadcast version.
That's the most random. Like that's kind of unbelievable.
Very
like,
American.
It would be a weird thing to say to somebody.
Very, very, very American. Like the violence is cool.
Right.
Sex no go. If you were producing this in France, it would be the other way around.
Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of French, Mobius, like, did you connect with him when you were working on Matrix, or how did you meet him?
Well, he was in Los Angeles for a long time. He came to Los Angeles working on Tron, and I was at Disney Studios actually at the same time when he was working on Tron. And I used to go into the Tron production area and see his storyboards and just was blown away. I mean, I've been a fan of his since high school, but it wasn't until after he left Disney, he and a guy named Arnie Wong, who was one of the animation producers on Tron. I mean, he was anyway. So they were trying to do this animated Mobius movie, and so they made this trailer, and it was a project called Internal Transfer, and I was an animator on that. So I got to meet him, and I speak French, by the way. So I went to French school because my dad was a diplomat, and so I got to know him. I went out to dinner with him and got to know him, and he was very complimentary. And actually, the design that ended up in Internal Transfer, which is this, I don't know if you saw the trailer, but there's this mechanical head that is kind of this negative space that forms out of this. I gave him that idea actually, because he was kind of stuck trying to design this kind of super being, this kind of celestial kind of cybernetic super being. And I had done some sketches, and I thought, well, why can't the face be made up mostly of empty space, but just kind of draw the outline of it? And he liked that idea, and I was still working on it, and I was still trying to perfect that idea. And like in a matter of a couple of hours, he created this like beautiful, perfect interpretation or rendition of that concept, and it was just amazing to watch him work. I mean, I've worked with a lot of artists. He was by far and away the single most amazing. I mean, he was, I create a lot of waste when I draw. Like I'll draw a lot of rough drafts, and with Mobius, like there is not a single wasted line. Like every time his pen touches paper, it's perfect. It was really just awe-inspiring to see somebody with that level of mastery.
That makes me think about some of the people that you've employed over the years are people who come from comics. I wonder if they possess any kind of ability that you notice that is different, not better or worse, maybe better, maybe worse, than somebody who's like a studied animation practitioner.
Well, it's a very different art form. I mean, So I did hire some comic book artists whose work that I admired because I was a fan of their work in comics. But I would have to say that trying to think now. Almost none of them was actually suited for animation work. It's a completely different discipline, and they're great comic book artists, but in general, I find that people who've done a lot of comic book work are not their skill set does not translate to doing good storyboards for animation. Funnily enough, actually, a guy who ended up being very successful in comics started out doing storyboards for AEON FLUX. So he went the other way. He started out doing storyboards and ended up doing comics. That's Eric Canetti. And he was a background designer, and he also did storyboards when he was starting out. But he was just starting out, and then he went on to a very you know his work, right?
Yeah, he there were some of those erotic comics that have the kind of AEON Flux energy.
I have a Street Angel by him in one of the Street Angel hardcovers.
Oh, cool.
But yeah, he definitely shows some of that AEON Flux, in his foreshortening and some of his compositions.
No, and he goes back and forth to doing animation work. I don't know if he still does it, but while he was doing comics, he would still go back and work on animation, doing storyboards, and he was very good at both. I mean, he understood the medium in a way that a lot of comic book artists don't. You just have to you just have to draw a lot more. You have to break down the action a lot further when you're doing storyboards. And then the other guy I think who does understand is Kyle Baker. Is another guy I worked with. But he goes back and forth between animation and comics, and he's very good at both.
Before we get out of here, we're coming up on like hour 45. I'm very interested in some recommendations or things that you dig in the form of comics and animation. Like I said, I saw some of these interviews, and you called out a couple animated pieces. This old interview, stuff from the 90s, and I dug those shorts out and was just blown away. So comic recommendations, manga, animation, anything that's like swirling around in your head right now.
I have to confess to you, and this is going to piss off your audience. It's going to piss you guys off as well. But I've become very impatient with comics lately. I used to read comics, but I think maybe the more I get involved in directing, I just feel, and I should couch that in something else, which is that I did try my hand at doing a comic story, and this was for a game company, and it was the only time I did a comic book story. It was pretty short, but it just felt very, very, I felt constricted because I felt like things that I could convey in movement and in animation was just very cumbersome, and I would say it wasn't as satisfying because the thing with what I found, and of course you'll probably disagree, and that's fine, but just my own experience is that after drawing a comic book page, what I draw is what you get. And I didn't like that. Because that's not the case with animation. Because what you draw is not what you get. What you get on screen is when it starts to move and it flows, what you're seeing and what you're giving to the audience is not what you drew. It has an extra magical quality to it, which is the movement, which didn't exist on the page. So that kind of alchemy, if you can think of it like that, you're transferring something which is made out of one material into something else when you're creating animation. But I wasn't getting that with comics. I was feeling like, I was creating drawings, and in the end, I'm getting a drawing. Having said that, there are some comic book artists and some comics that I do come back to, and I find them constantly inspiring. Well, Mobius is one, and pretty much anything that he's done. My favorite Japanese artist is Kazuo Umezu. And are you familiar with his work?
Yeah, Drifting Classroom, Cat-Eyed Boy, 14. Never heard of him.
14 is fantastic, yeah.
I just discovered that for the first time when I went to Japan in 2019. I was just digging for books, and it was this the image that attracted me was this guy walking around with a rooster head mask, and it was just like one of the scariest images.
Yeah. Watashi no Shingo is another good one. Baptism, and then Makoto-chan is fantastic. What I love about his work is that it's you're not quite sure how you're supposed to take it. It's very it's like what I admire in certain artists, the kind of artists, and I guess that I would count myself as being one of them, is that you're making art in a way that is not catering to any expectation. So the problem I have with, and again, I'm going to say something that's going to piss off a lot of people, but when I look at a lot of portfolios or people's Instagram pages, what I see very often is an artist who is trying to please a particular audience. And you can detect it in their work, and you can see that they're begging for approval. And when I see that and I detect that, it's an immediate, I don't know how to describe it. It's like there's a slight barrier for me. I don't feel like I connect with work where I detect that happening. So Umezu's work is great because he doesn't try to polish it or make it pretty. It is just what he it just pours out of him, and he's incredibly prolific, and it's constantly surprising. Anyway, I don't want to go on and on about it, but in animation, Yuasa, to me is really, really exciting and constantly surprising. And he's kind of the same way. It's like his work is not extremely. He doesn't spend a lot of time polishing his work. It's like there's so much of it that he just takes it to the point where it's clear enough to convey the idea, and then he moves on. Unlike a lot of Japanese animation, where it's just they just put highlights and shadows upon shadows, and it's effects upon effects, and it gets mannered. It's so layered with mannerism that I don't detect the spontaneous act. But Yuasa, there's a director I really, really like, and I'm sure you've seen his work, but his name is pretty unknown. It's Tetsuro Araki. So Death Note and Attack on Titan and High School of the Dead. But his episodes are he's a real director's director, and I get a lot of inspiration from his work.
When you wrote an essay about comics and animation, the sort of failures of the comic page, and you equated it with stuff that you saw in animation as well. It was an essay from like 1998. It was a very, very dismal time. in the medium of comics in a lot of ways. But there were some gems out there, like the works of guys like Dan Clowes, and things were happening on the independent scene. Are those kind of comics on your radar? Comics like 8 Ball at the time?
At the time when those were coming out, I was following them for a while. I'm trying to remember some of the titles. Something about a fist in a velvet glove.
Yeah, velvet glove cast in iron.
Yeah. But I kind of I didn't really see them as comics so much as they were just, it was like reading somebody's, I don't know. I guess for me, they just kind of didn't really leave a lasting impression. Like, I didn't find anything useful out of that material. I think that with a lot of comics and with films, and with animation, is that I don't think that it's a good use of the medium to be too, what's the word, slice of life. I think that if I want to experience slice of life, I'll just live my life. I have plenty of slice of life in my life, in my real life. I don't need to read a book to get slice of life, or to go to the movies, to see something that's unadorned. I want adornment. I want to see something heightened. So when I go to see a movie, I want to see something that is mythic, iconic, something that I can't experience in my own slice of life. And it especially applies to animation, I think. So I see a lot of, I see it a lot in my students, actually, and I kind of discourage it. It's like they make their own student films, and it's all slice of life, and it's all like this very internal kind of like somebody feeling lonely and like sitting on a corner looking at flowers and remembering their childhood or something like that. It's like, don't do that. Like, that's not why I want to watch a film. Have your character do something. Have your character do something unique. Okay, so the thing that I tell my students is that there are certain things that happen in your life that are one-time events that are unique and special. Those make good subjects for a film. So if you're creating a fictional character, imagine that fictional character's life, and imagine a singular event in that character's life that happened one time, that is a pivotal moment in that character's life. Make your film about that, okay? Don't make your film about something that happens every day. Like, nobody wants to see that. I don't want to see that. Like, if I had a choice between seeing a film about something that happens in somebody's daily life versus a film, and it doesn't have to be a film, it can be a clip on YouTube, okay? So am I going to click on a clip on YouTube that is a singular event that happened once in the history of the universe? Or am I going to click on a clip of something that happens every day? Well, I'm going to click on the first one every time. So I tell my students, make your films about unique events, okay? So so that's my answer to that.
I love it. You got anything else, Jimmy?
No, I'm ready for the Peter Chung how-to book. The book on directing. Turn that course into something that I can take home and read and study, because of this sounds great.
I'm going to make a pledge here today.
Look, we can keep talking. Turn off the camera.
I'm going to make a pledge right here today, Peter. I'm never going to have my characters say that they love each other. It ain't happening.
Right. No, you're explaining the joke. Everybody, see, that's the thing. Everybody understands that a comedian should never explain the joke, okay? If you do, you should be on stage telling jokes, okay? What they don't, for some reason, they let filmmakers explain the joke. So the fact that character A loves character B, that's the punchline. That's the thing that I'm supposed to get through watching how they behave. And I'm supposed to go, oh, that character loves this character, and that's how I get to feel it. But if you just tell me "Oh, I love you," then I don't get to feel it because you've just explained the joke, and so like I don't get to laugh if you explain why it's funny. I don't get to have that moment of realization, that epiphany of going, "Oh, that's funny," because you've put the pieces together and go, "Oh yeah, that is funny," and that's why you laugh, and that's a genuine laugh. Okay. But if you tell me, "Oh, I got to go do this thing," because if I don't, then this other thing, like, don't tell me that. Like, let me understand that that's what you have to do. And having that realization, that's going to make it feel urgent. But if you tell me it's urgent, then I'm not going to feel that it's urgent.
Totally. Like there was a the David Mamet masterclass. He talks about that. He says, like, you never go to a party, meet a guy, and hear them say, "Here, let me tell you a couple of things about me and my past and all the experiences that I've been through." It rings as false immediately. Like, whatever he's saying is a lie. So you're pandering to the audience, and every medium has this thing, these traps that you could fall into. Don't use adverbs. You're moving quickly.
Yeah.
How about you sell me on the scene a little bit more and let us feel that you're moving us quickly? Neil Gaiman's masterclass is like, if I want you to cry, I'm going to kill a unicorn and it's going to break your heart. Super fun. Peter, where is that Instagram account
It's
located?
Peter K. Chung. So I came late to Instagram. So believe it or not, there are other people named Peter Chung in the world. So Peter Chung was already taken. So it's Peter K. Chung. And I have a little AEON FLUX in my icon. That's my icon. So look for that. And I am hoping and planning, actually more than a hope, I'm planning to open a Patreon. So
that makes me like, do you ever think of using crowdfunding, Kickstarter, something like that, to completely facilitate the production?
Well, I'm hoping that Patreon will help with that. And then beyond that, I am interested, and I know this is very controversial, but I am interested in selling NFTs as well. So that's a way of generating funds to support. And it's not an end in itself; it's a means towards financing my animation projects. But at this stage in my career, I'm not willing to give away everything the way I did with AEON FLUX, which was near the beginning. But now I need to be able to hang on to some control and some ownership of what I've created.
That sounds fantastic. When you get your Patreon up, this video is going to go up Sunday, but when you get your Patreon up, let me know. Send me the link. I could put that in the description, because I feel like this interview is going to be seen by a lot of people over time, and that'll attract some people there. But I mean, I have a million questions, but I do think we should leave it. You were very, very generous with your time. Right now, is there anything else you're working on that you want to sort of tease or let people know?
As I said, I do have my original new adult animated project. I'm not going to talk about that right now because I haven't really. I mean, I've shared it with a few people professionally, but I'm not really ready to announce it publicly yet. And other than that, I've just actually I'm still in the process of. I've been working on this show called Victor and Valentino for Cartoon Network, and one thing that I haven't announced is that right now I'm directing a special episode of Victor and Valentino, which I wrote and designed and directed myself, and storyboarded the whole thing. And I'll be supervising the animation, and that'll be coming out sometime early next year. But it's a special episode. Like one of the animators, he looked at the animatic and said, "This is AEON FLUX for kids," because it's an episode that doesn't have any dialogue, and it kind of was my attempt to put into practice all of the lessons that I try to teach my students. So in a way, I kind of did it as a teaching tool, where I tried to apply all of the filmmaking principles that I try to teach. Because sometimes I think with students, you can talk about it and give them theory and reasons, but unless you show that it can be done, it's like they're going to be skeptical. So,
Man,
so
that
I'm
sounds like
showing
a
them-
good episode.
I'm showing
can't
them how
wait.
it can. I'm showing them how it can be done. So,
Peter, did
yeah.
you
So look out for that.
did you do the opening title sequence for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles?
Yeah. I storyboarded that. Yeah, and I did some of the animation for that as well.
Iconic.
It's
We would
not
love
very
we
good.
would
I
love
mean,
to have you come back. Oh,
that
say
was the
what?
first one I did, and I don't like that opening. It was kind of a joke because I thought that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was a joke. At the time that I was working on it, I had no idea it was going to take off. I just thought I actually felt sorry for the toy company because the toy company was putting up all this money to produce this animated show, which was going to, promote their toy line. But it was based on this obscure comic book that nobody had heard of, which had this ridiculous title. But it turns out that the title was great. I mean, kids, the title Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles made the show, because what kid isn't going to tune in to watch something that has that title? So.
Totally made the comic. They sold it.
Yeah.
In some ads and some trade publications. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. It has a flow to it, a little iambic pentameter built in to the cadence and everything. Peter, when you have this next project, if you have a media docket that you're going to do, we would love to talk to you again to promote
sure.
These future ideas. I got a lot out of this conversation. I'm excited to turn this chair right around and get right back to business, man. So thank you very much for coming by. Everybody,
Okay, sure.
join Peter's Instagram. There will be a link in the description below this video, and appreciate you taking the time with us, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Peter.
Okay, I enjoyed it, and thank you very much.